Hello everybody, thank you for tuning in. So if you've worked through all of the economic immigration streams, this is the last lesson for you. So congratulations if you went through the lessons on the self-employed stream, the IIVC, the SUV, Express Entry, the Federal Skilled Trades program, the Canadian Experience class, and the Federal Skilled Worker, of course. The Federal Skilled Worker program, though, has an extra little step. And that is, of course, the points and how those points relate to the Federal Skilled Worker Program in general, and of course, how it relates to Express Entry. So this is one of the trickiest areas of all of the economic streams, and personally, I think this is one of the most difficult areas to have on your exam. So this lesson is going to really thoroughly cover this whole area for you, because it might play a role in your exam, and it's definitely going to play a role in your career as an immigration consultant. So when you're working your way through these lessons, as usual, it's really important to understand Express Entry and how this works with the Canadian Experience class, the Federal Skilled Trades program, and of course the Federal Skilled Worker program. The Federal Skilled Worker program, though, just like I said, has an extra step. So you have those definitions that the person has to meet, but you have an extra little step, and that is the points system in the Federal Skilled Worker program. So there's a lot of confusion. We get a lot of questions from people who seem to be confused about the role of those points and how it relates to Express Entry. So by the end of this lesson, you're going to have this topic completely covered in terms of how to prepare for this for your full skills exam. So remember, with the Federal Skilled Worker program, if a person is going to immigrate under this program, as a first step, they would need to create that profile in Express Entry. Now there is, of course, a pre-step for you as an RCIC and what your role is in helping someone immigrate through this program. That first step, of course, or the pre-step, I guess, if someone's using an RCIC, is for the RCIC to conduct an assessment and see if the person actually qualifies to be selected for an invitation to apply for permanent residency through the Federal Skilled Worker program. If the person doesn't meet those qualifications and doesn't meet the Canadian Experience class or the Federal Skilled Trades program, you'll obviously try to find a different solution for this person to immigrate. But if the person meets that criteria, then you'll proceed with all of these steps. Okay, so remember, after that first step of creating the profile, the person would move into that Express Entry pool, and that of course would be only if the person meets those minimum requirements of either the Skilled Worker program, the Federal Skilled Trades program, or the Canadian Experience class. Alright, if the person meets the cutoff, we'll explore this pretty thoroughly near the end of the video as well. If the person meets the cutoff score for the CRS points, and that's not the Federal Skilled Worker points, that's the CRS points, then he or she would receive an invitation to apply. And in this case, we're looking at the Federal Skilled Worker program, so the person, if he or she qualifies for the Federal Skilled Worker program, meets all the CRS points, exceeds the cutoff, then they would apply for permanent residency because they would have that invitation to apply. Okay, so I know how much you're reading these days. Now, one of the best sources that you can use in order to really prepare yourself by understanding general immigration knowledge is the CIC website. So really work your way through that website. There are a lot of really interesting pages in there. And of course, regulations. So your IRPA and regulations is, again, of course, a really great source for you to use. The difference between the regulations, in this case anyways, and the CIC website is that the CIC website is a bit more thorough, and it's a bit more made for the public. So you might find that when you're reading the Act and regulations, sometimes it sounds a little bit, it's full of legalese, of course. But the CIC website is made for the public, so it's a little bit easier to read and to understand. And of course, it gives more details on those little elements that you're looking at in the regulations. So of course, you're going to have to read as much as you can with any topic that you're studying. With the Federal Skilled Worker Program, there's a lot of really great links for you. These are all, of course, on the page, probably just above the video here. And work your way through these, because this is going to, again, really help you in preparing for your exam. So we have quite a few goals to accomplish today. Now, we are going to, of course, learn about the Federal Skilled Worker Program through the context of the points system. So we talked about those general requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program in the previous videos and in those exam simulations. This one's going to focus more on the points system, so it's going to peel back another layer of the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Okay, we have to see this, of course, it's one thing to understand the Federal Skilled Worker Program in terms of general immigration knowledge. What we do at Full Skills Exam Prep is we take all of that general immigration information and put it in the context of the exam. So we have to see this, of course, in the context of your upcoming ICCRC Full Skills exam. We're going to have 3 questions to look at, the same as we always do. And this is going to really help you to fully understand the Federal Skilled Worker Program in terms of points and the general requirements, and of course how all this relates to express entry. So it's going to be a pretty big lesson today, and you're going to work your way through quite a bit of information, but again, at the end of this, you're going to be one step closer to passing the ICCRC Full Skills exam. So when you're looking at Regulation 76, you have the points. So a general outline of the points requirement for the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Okay, now these points, of course, are used to determine how well a person will be able to become economically established in Canada. The maximum amount of points is 100, and the minimum, which is the most important part for you, of course, is 67. So we're going to go through each element of this really thoroughly through the context of questions, and this is going to really help you to understand this point system for the Federal Skilled Worker Program and how it relates to potential questions on your ICCRC Full Skills exam. Okay, so you have this grid ready for you as well. It's on the website. So if you're looking at this through the free lessons section of www.fullskillsexamprep.com, then you could just print this off if you want, or you could just do a little sketch if you want to as well, to work your way through these scenarios. And we're going to do this really step by step. It's going to take us quite a bit of time today, probably about an hour, but when you practice with these types of questions, you're going to get faster and faster at these, especially if you're doing the exam simulations. And by the time you become an expert on this, you'll be able to answer these types of questions in hopefully 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, so we have 3 questions we're going to look at, same as usual. This one's a bit different though, because we're going to look at this through the context of an easy question dealing with the Federal Skilled Worker points. Now that's the person in that scenario is named Shing. We're going to look at a question that is medium in terms of difficulty, and that's going to be Josie. And we're going to look at a very difficult question, and that is with Alexa. So our first sample question here is with Shing. Now remember, sample questions are essential in preparing you for the full skills exam because you have to have that really great base of immigration knowledge, which if you pass your diploma or certificate course, you probably have. But the really important part is to see all this information in the context of questions. So here's your first sample question. The person is named Shing, and remember that this is your easy sample question. So I'll read this out to you just in case you are listening to this while doing something else. Okay, we have Shing. Shing, 40, is from China and has been living in Thailand for the past 3 years. She began working as a corporate accountant for China Corp 4 years ago, and after her first year, she was transferred to the Bangkok office to work on a full-time basis. She holds a 4-year bachelor's degree and a master's degree in finance, and received a CELPIP score of 9 in speaking and listening and 8 in reading and writing. Although she has never been to Canada, her husband worked in Hamilton, Ontario for a year as a computer technician a few years ago, and loves the idea of returning since he already speaks English at an intermediate level. She also has an uncle in Regina, Saskatchewan, who has promised her a job even though he has not been able to obtain an LMIA. Is Shing likely to meet the minimum points requirements for the federal skilled worker class to allow her to move into the pool of qualified candidates in express entry? Now we're going to take a look at our potential answers. So we have yes, because she has 90 points, which is almost the maximum. For B, we have yes, because she has 75 points, which exceeds the minimum points requirements. We have C, no, because she does not meet the minimum requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program and will therefore not be eligible to be assessed on the 100-point scale. And we have D, no, because she only has 67 points, but must exceed 67 points. So as always, if you want to pause the video and work your way through this question before looking at the analysis, that is a good idea. So you can pause right now. And if you paused and came back, we're going to move on to the next question. So here we have Josie. Now remember, this is your medium difficulty question. Okay, so Josie is an Estonian who's exploring her immigration options and would like to know if she qualifies for the Federal Skilled Worker Program if she were to make an express entry profile. She is very serious about her immigration plan and has already taken her French and English language exams as a first step. In English, she received a CLB 5 in each area of the exam. And in French, she received a CLB 8 in each area. She graduated high school at 18 years of age and began working in her career as an office administrator immediately. She has been in this position for the past 2 years, and though she has never been to Canada, she has been dating a Canadian man, Cecil, who lives in her town, and he told her that she can stay at his apartment in Toronto for free if she moves there. Does Josie meet the minimum points requirements for the Federal Skilled Worker Program? And then for potential answers, we have A, yes, because she meets the minimum requirements in terms of education, experience, and language. We have B, yes, she exceeds the minimum amount of points required. We have C, no, she only has a total of 52 points And here is your third and final question. So remember that when we work through these sample questions, we always make them a little bit more difficult as we progress. When you face these difficult questions, and this one, as you can see, is pretty long as well, you know what, it's good practice for you. That's, of course, the feedback that we get from all of our clients really is that our material, our questions is just a little bit more difficult than, or sometimes way more difficult like this than the real exam. And it's good for you, of course, because when you practice with these difficult questions, when you go take the real exam, well, hopefully those questions are that much easier for you because, of course, you're taking all the time now to make sure that you're working through these tougher questions. Okay, so I'll read this one to you just in case you are on the bus or in your car or maybe listening while doing housework, or if you have kids like I do, well, maybe you're feeding your kids and listening to this. Well, good for you. If you're doing two things at the same time like that, it's great. That's what you need to do in order to, of course, be successful in your exam, is really multitask and don't let anything stop you. There's no excuses. So good for you if you are listening to this while attending to some of your other responsibilities. All right, so we have Alexa here. Alexa is a 36-year-old citizen of Finland who would like to immigrate to Canada through the Federal Skilled Worker Program, as she feels that this would give her the freedom to live anywhere in Canada that she wants to, depending on which city she likes best. She explains to you that she is currently in Winnipeg working on a one-year contract for Ericsson Technologies and received the job offer because there was a shortage of electrical engineers at the time. Ericsson received an LMIA because of this shortage and hired Alexa immediately after her interview by telephone because they were impressed with her 7 years of experience in this field. The company has been very happy with her work performance since she started a couple of months ago and have offered her a full-time permanent job if she receives permanent residency. Alexa explains to you that she has a 4-year Bachelor of Engineering degree from the University of Finland and a 2-year master's degree from the online master's degree store. She received the results of her ECA and language results at the same time. And unfortunately for her ECA, the master's degree was not considered to meet the Canadian equivalent. However, the good news was with her language exam scores, where she received a band 6.5 in each area of her IELTS exam and a test score of 200 in listening and writing, 170 in reading, and 229 in speaking.
Assuming that the most recent cutoff score in the Express Entry CRS has been around 450 points, does Alexa meet the points requirements of both the FSW and exceed the minimum, or meet or exceed, I guess, the minimum CRS score in Express Entry to receive an ITA? And then I'll just read out A, B, C, D for you, just in case you're listening to this. For A, she exceeds the minimum amount of points required to qualify as a federal skilled worker, but does not have the required CRS points to receive an ITA. For B, she currently has 81 points as a federal skilled worker and over 450 CRS points. So yes, she meets the qualifications of both. C, her federal skilled worker points will get added to her CRS, and that will give her enough points to exceed the CRS cutoff score. And finally, D, she does not have the required FSW points, but she has the required CRS points. So she'll receive an ITA.
Okay, so with Alexa, if you work your way through this, or you are working your way through this, I think this is a really great example of how related all of these little pieces of the puzzle are in terms of exam scenarios. So you can see with her that you definitely have express entry procedures as part of that question. Of course, CRS points play a huge role in there as well, and also the federal skilled worker points. These are, of course, all related to each other as well. So if you understand express entry procedures perfectly, then you're about halfway through to answering the question correctly. If you only understand the federal skilled worker points, then again, you're about halfway through. Of course, you have to understand CRS points as part of the express entry procedures in order to work your way towards the correct answer in this. So remember that each piece of the puzzle for this type of question, and for all the questions really, are equally as important for you to be able to understand and demonstrate that understanding through the context of questions. Okay, so let's work our way through these scenarios step by step. So if you're looking at Regulation 78, this of course is in your test day data book as well. You have the education points for the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So this one has quite a few points. There's 25 maximum points in education, and we're going to see how this relates to the scenarios that we're looking at. Okay, so we could see that somebody with a PhD would receive 25 points, which is the maximum. Okay, just under that, at 23 points, is somebody with a master's degree. With 23 points, you have another option, and that is a university level entry to practice professional degree. Of course, with any degrees, really, the equivalent is accepted as well. Those entry to practice degrees, though, are pretty special in that they have to be pretty specific. So they have to be skill level A. The occupation itself has to be licensed by a provincial regulatory body. And then they give the only options here. So medicine, veterinary medicine, dentistry, podiatry, optometry, law, chiropractic medicine, or pharmacy. So remember that the person's license would have to transfer over anyways for this. Okay, and then we have 2 or more Canadian post-secondary degrees, or diplomas, or equal. With this one here, one of those has to be a minimum of 3 years in length. So if somebody has a 3-year bachelor's degree and that also a 1-year diploma, that would be a good example of a person who'd receive 22 points in those initial federal skilled worker points. So when you're looking at these points as well, when you're thinking of the difference between a master's degree and a PhD, in real life, it's about 4 years of work after a master's degree to get a PhD. So if you're thinking of maybe a question where it says something like, how can this person increase his points quickly? Which we have a couple examples of in the simulations. You probably wouldn't say get a PhD because it would take him 4 years. And at the same time, you have to think of the age points that would go down during that time. Okay, so that's not in one of the scenarios we're going to look at, but it is something for you to think about. And it's something that happens in real life as well when you're advising clients. Okay, as we go down that list, we have a single 3-year degree or diploma. Now, all of these say Canadian because we're going to take a look in the next slide, but these people need an ECA to prove their degree is similar or meets the same criteria as a Canadian degree. Okay, so that one is 21 points. And then a 2-year degree or diploma is 19 points. A 1-year is 15 points. And a high school diploma is 5 points. Remember that the high school diploma is the absolute minimum in this. So even if a person gets all of the points available for everything else and maybe has 90 points in this, but doesn't have a Canadian or the equivalent of a Canadian high school diploma, then that person does not meet the minimum requirements of this program. Okay, so when we're looking at ECAs, remember in the Federal Skilled Worker Program, there's a minimum of a high school diploma. Now that's not just any high school diploma, that has to be a Canadian high school diploma. Of course, most people don't have a Canadian high school diploma who are immigrating through the Federal Skilled Worker Program. If that high school diploma is from a different country, which in most cases it will be, then it needs an ECA. Okay, so remember that the Education Credential Assessment will verify if that high school diploma meets the Canadian equivalent. All right, so remember that it's not only for a high school diploma though, it's for all the degrees, all of the certifications, everything like that has to be proven to be the Canadian equivalent. And the way to do that, of course, is through an ECA. Okay, so you have these other people here who are professionals with a regulatory body. So if you remember from before, we saw those specific degrees and certifications that are used for this. So people who work in medicine, so veterinarians, dentists, optometrists, lawyers are pretty much the only ones outside of medicine in this area here of the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So they have to verify that those credentials are either Canadian. If they're not Canadian, which, like I said, most of the time they will not be, then they would need an ECA. That ECA has to prove that their credentials qualify for at least one of the provinces. So just like the Federal Skilled Trades Program, the Federal Skilled Worker Program has something similar to this, where they would have to prove that they can work in at least one of the provinces. So if you're an unlicensed dentist, of course you can't work in Canada. So that's one of the things that the ECA proves, is that a person can work in Canada. So you don't have people sort of showing up and not being able to work. So when you're looking at education, this is very similar to the self-employed stream that we saw before, but this actually relates to all the immigration streams, really. Remember that if a person has more than one degree or more than one certification, etc., those points aren't cumulative. So the highest degree, remember that degree has to be ECA verified. So the highest degree reflects the points awarded. Now we have an example over here for you. This is with Virginia. So Virginia graduated from high school in 2003. and took part-time university classes for 6 years to earn a diploma in marketing. She says that the diploma is a 2-year diploma, but she was working full-time and has 3 kids to take care of, so she took longer. How many points is she likely to gain as a federal skilled worker for her education? So as a first step, you can see that she completed her high school in 2003. You would assume that that's about 12 years of study. And that is 5 points in the Federal Skilled Worker Program. When you see something like this as well, you should be pretty happy because you know that in terms of education anyways, she meets the minimum requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker with education. So you'd have to explore, of course, work experience and language to see if she meets the complete minimum qualifications for the Federal Skilled Worker Program. But in terms of education, you know that she's set. Now, as we move on to that diploma, so this is a 2-year diploma. If it took her 20 years to get, that's perfectly fine. But remember, it's the hours of the diploma or the time of the diploma itself, not the amount of time that the person took to gain that diploma. Okay, so if somebody took, in her case, she took 6 years to earn a 2-year diploma. That doesn't mean that this is above 3 years to get extra points. This means that this is a 2-year diploma. She did it part-time, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, so with that, that's actually 19 points. But what you're thinking of now, of course, is what are the total amount of points that she would get in terms of education under Regulation 78? And that answer, of course, is 19. So you don't add those up. It wouldn't be 24. It would be 19 because, of course, the highest degree awarded reflects the amount of points that she would get. So when we go back to that chart referring to the education points for the Federal Skilled Worker Program, we could see that she would get 19 points over here as well. Now, one thing to think about with these types of questions referring to education is that in this scenario, they didn't mention anything about an ECA. So you wouldn't really read into that too much. If one of the answers says, depending on if the ECA comes back positive, of course that should really raise some red lights for you to think about. But if they don't mention ECA, then you wouldn't really think of it in terms of a question like this, where they're asking how many points she would get in education, in this first part, of course, of the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So let's take a look at how education played a role in those 3 scenarios that we're looking at. So with Shing, we can see the important part referring to education over here. And it's pretty straightforward. So she holds a 4-year bachelor's degree and a master's degree in finance. When we move on to Josie, so remember Josie is, that scenario is it's medium in terms of difficulty. So we can see with this one here, we have to read through the scenario a little bit, and we can see that she graduated high school at 18 years of age and began working in her career as an office administrator immediately. She's been in this position for 2 years, and there's no other mention of education. So you're going to have to kind of see this through the context of the information that they give, of course, to see her highest level of education. Finally, remember with Alexa. So Alexa is a pretty difficult scenario and a pretty difficult question to answer. With this one here, you can see that the ECA really plays a role in answering this question properly. So if you don't understand how the ECA works, you wouldn't be able to understand how to answer this question properly. So remember with her, she has a 4-year degree a bachelor's degree in engineering, and a 2-year master's degree. All right, the ECA came back positive for the Bachelor of Engineering degree, but came back negative for the master's degree. All right, so if you need to pause the video or something like that to fill in your answer sheet regarding education, you could go right ahead. We'll go through these step by step to make sure that we are on the same page in terms of how to answer this portion of the question. Okay, with Shing, so that one was pretty straightforward. There's no mention of an ECA, so we wouldn't really worry about it. If you got 23 points over here, then you are doing this correct. So she has a master's degree in finance. The second portion there of the 23 points, where it's a entry to practice professional degree, this doesn't play a role in her scenario, so we wouldn't even think about this at all. Okay, so you're looking at 23 points for her. When we move on to Josie, we have that part of the scenario again that we have to really look at, and you're going to have to think a little bit deeper in this one here. It doesn't overtly say she has a bachelor's degree, she has a master's degree, she has this, this, this. It just says that she graduated from high school and then began working, and that's it. So with this one here, if you got 5 points, then again, you are correct. Again, there's no mention of an ECA or anything like that, so we wouldn't really think of this in terms of the context of the question. Okay, this one is where it gets a little bit more difficult. So remember that she has a 4-year Bachelor of Engineering degree. It says the University of Finland. That shouldn't really play a role in your answer. Okay, and the 2-year master's degree from the online master's degree store. So you know, in real life, the University of Finland would probably be a great university to receive an ECA from. Meanwhile, the online master's degree store in real life, yeah, it would probably not work. In this one here, you wouldn't read into it too much in terms of the context of questions for your exam. But you can see that with the ECA, it followed pretty much that anyways. So she didn't receive a positive response for the master's degree, but she did receive a positive response for the bachelor's degree. So with this one, you are just looking at essentially a bachelor's degree. So the master's degree, you just sort of delete that because it didn't receive an ECA. So it's almost as if it doesn't exist in terms of immigration anyways. So if you're working your way through your points grid, you should have this to begin. So with Shing, we're at 23 points in terms of education, so she almost met the maximum because of that master's degree. Josie was on the other end, so Josie met the bare minimum in that she only had a high school diploma. And Alexa had a bachelor's degree because her master's degree didn't count. So you're looking at 23 points for Shing, 5 for Josie, and 21 for Alexa. So that covers the education points that we need to look at. When you take a look at Regulation 79, you can see that language, of course, plays a huge role in the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Actually, in all the economic classes, really, language exams are incredibly important. You're going to see this in real life once you start working as an RCIC, that the best way for your clients to get the most points in everything, when you're looking at this, you could see even with the Federal Skilled Worker, those 67 minimum points that they need, the language exam plays a huge role. It's almost half of the points that they need can be obtained through demonstrating a high language score. So it's something really, really important to be able to understand. The beauty of language exams and language results in terms of your ICCRC full skills exam is that it crosses into so many immigration streams. So almost all of the provincial nominee programs, all of the economic classes as well, require language results. So if you understand language results and how they relate to these scenarios, you're going to be really in a strong position to answer a lot of questions in your ICCRC full skills exam because it covers quite a few areas of immigration. Okay, so this section here, we're going to talk about this really thoroughly, just to, again, really prepare you for anything that comes up in your ICCRC full skills exam in terms of language exams. Okay, let's take a look at language exams and how they relate to the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So understanding language exams is, of course, really essential in passing the full skills exam. Just like I said before, almost every single provincial nominee program, almost every single economic immigration program has a language exam requirement in it. So by understanding this area of immigration thoroughly, you're really helping yourself to understand part of almost every immigration stream in terms of economic immigration. Okay, so you have this chart in your test day data book as well. And we are looking at first official language versus second official language. And of course the points that a person can receive in the Federal Skilled Worker Program for their language results. So you can see that you have CLB 7, CLB 8, and CLB 9 or more. And then you have this subdivided into each factor of the exam. So you have speaking, listening, reading, and writing, and a total. Remember that any score that goes below a CLB 7 in the first official language means that a person is not eligible to apply under the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So they wouldn't meet the minimum requirements in this. An example would be if a person has let's say a CLB 8 in speaking and a CLB 7 in listening and a CLB 6 in reading and then a CLB 7 in writing. So you might think that the average of this is CLB 7, so it's okay. It's not, though. So the person wouldn't meet the minimum requirements because of that one element of the exam. In that case, it was reading that had a CLB 6. However, a mix is okay as long as everything is above CLB 7. So a person can have a CLB 9 in speaking, a CLB 7 in listening, a CLB 9 in reading, and a CLB 8 in writing. That's perfectly fine, and those points would add up. Okay, there's a second language portion of this as well, and this is really interesting because if a person has above and including CLB 5 in each ability, so that means in speaking, reading, listening, and writing of the second official language, then that would gain this person 4 extra points. So that's 4 in total. That's not 4 for each element. That's not 4 for speaking, 4 for listening, 4 for writing, 4 for reading. That's 4 in total. And that's only if the person has a minimum CLB 5 in each. Okay, so because language exams are so important for your ICCRC full skills exam, let's just go over a couple of little tips so that we can really make sure that we're covered in anything that has to do with language exams for your big ICCRC full skills exam. So remember that when a person takes language exams for both English and French, so for English it would be IELTS or CELPIP, and French would be TEF, whichever results come back with the highest CLB, that's going to be considered the first language. Okay, and of course this is only English and French. So there aren't any points given if a person speaks Hungarian or Italian or any other language. All right, so just like I said before, in this case here with the Federal Skilled Worker Program, you're looking at the minimum. Now, the minimum required in this is a CLB 7. If a person has a CLB 6 in anything in that first language, then they do not meet the requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So it's not the overall score. It is each individual score. All right, a really important step that you probably have by now if you've worked your way through the other lessons is that you have to connect those dots. So you have to go from the IELTS score or the TEF score or the CELPIP score and connect that to the CLB. Then you'd have to connect that CLB score to the points that are given for that score. And it might seem a little bit complicated at first, but once you work your way through a lot of these scenarios dealing with language exams, it's going to get easier and easier. And of course, you have your test day data book that has a chart with all this linked up pretty easily for you. All right, and just like I said before, a mix is perfectly fine as long as everything exceeds the minimum. So if a person has a CLB 10 in speaking, and a CLB 8 in listening, and a CLB 7 in reading, and a CLB 9 in writing, that's perfectly fine because the person exceeds the minimum in each element of the exam. So the person exceeds the minimum in speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Again, if that person had under CLB 7 in one of those elements, then he or she would not meet those minimum requirements.
So we'll go through this section here pretty quickly. We've gone through this a little bit already in some of the previous lessons, and by that I mean the topic of transitioning from a language score from an exam to the CLB, and then of course transitioning that to the requirements of the immigration stream that you're looking at. And in this one here we can see a CLB 9. So CLB 9 is a great level of English. In the real world as RCICs, you're always looking for a client who has a CLB 9 because in terms of express entry, it opens up a lot of doors. Well, what exactly is a CLB 9 in terms of IELTS? Well, it's a 7 in everything except an 8 in listening. For CELPIP, CELPIP's really straightforward. It's just a 9 in everything. For TEF, it's a 371 to 392 in speaking and writing, and then listening is a 298 to 315. And finally, reading is a 248 to 262. And then TCF, so the new exam, well, it's not a new exam, but it's newly accepted for immigration purposes. And that score, of course, is a 14 or 15 in writing or reading. Listening is a 523 to 548, and reading is a 524 to 548. All right, so we can see that with TCF as well, the scores for listening and reading are pretty similar. There's just a small little difference. And for all of them, the score is, it's not 100% or anything like that. Of course, CLB 9, remember the CLB goes up to 12, but CLB 9 is, it's a very high level of English that your client is demonstrating. Or of course, when we're looking at this in the context of scenarios, well, we're going to see a few examples in this lesson here that really take a look at CLB and how it relates to, of course, potential questions on your exam. But really, those questions that we are studying for represent your life as consultants and situations that will probably arise in your life as a consultant when you're looking at federal skilled worker, when you're looking at express entry. So when we drop down a little bit to CLB 8, well, we can see the scores over here. And we can see that for IELTS, it really just drops a 0.5 of a band. So listening is now a 7.5, and everything else is a 6.5. For IELTS at a CLB 8. For CELPIP, an 8 is an 8, so it's pretty straightforward there. For TEF, we can see that the score dropped a little bit as well, and for writing and speaking, we are looking at a 349 to 370. For listening, it's 280 to 297, and reading is 233 to 247. And finally, with le TCF, we are looking at a 12 or 13 in speaking and writing. For listening, we're looking at a 503 to 522, and reading is a 499 to 523. And finally, a CLB7. So we've seen this in a couple of the other lessons that we went through. And it's because CLB7, I would say it's the most common minimum language score required in the economic program. So we see it quite a bit. It doesn't mean that all of the programs require a CLB7. Some of them require a little bit lower, as we've seen with the Federal Skilled Trades lesson, as we saw with the AIPP lesson. Self-employed doesn't really have a minimum either, but it's important to know, of course, a CLB7 is the minimum requirement for the Federal Skilled Worker Program. And what is a CLB7? Well, we're looking at IELTS Band 6 and everything. We're looking at a CELPIP score of 7 in everything. We're looking at a 310 to 348 in speaking and writing in the TEF. We are looking at a 249 to 279 in listening in the TEF. And TEF's reading score that correlates with the CLB7 is 207 to 232. For le TCF, we are looking at a writing score and speaking score of 10 to 11. We're looking at a listening score of 458 to 502 and a reading score of 453 to 498.
Now, when we take a look at our scenarios again, and we see how the scenarios are related to language scores, we can see with Shing that they're pretty straightforward here. So we have her receiving a CELPIP score of 9 in speaking and listening and an 8 in reading and writing. So with Shing, you probably know that you'll have to correlate that CELPIP score to the CLB and then correlate that to the points in the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Josie in the middle here is a bit more straightforward, so they just give everything they say. In English, she received a CLB 5 in each area, and in French, she received a CLB 8. All right, and finally with Alexa, you've got a bit more of a complicated situation. So she has a band 6.5 in each area of the IELTS exam. And then with TEF, she received a score of 200 in listening and writing, 170 in reading, and 229 in speaking. So this is interesting because you're going to have to correlate those individual scores to the CLB for 2 languages and see which one is the first language, which one's going to be the second language, and if she meets the minimum requirements in terms of language. Okay, so if you worked your way through Shing and that scenario, you probably came up with what we're going to go through here. So with this, we're going to go through this really step by step, even though you probably got the answer if you're using the test day data booklet. But let's go through this together. Okay, so when we're looking at each element of her exam, so we're always looking at speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Now in her case, she received a 9 in both speaking and listening. In reading and writing, she received an 8 in her CELPIP score. Now if you're using your test day data booklet, it'll link all this together for you. We can see that her CLB score is the exact same because that's the way that CELPIP is organized. So a CELPIP score of 9 is a CLB 9. So we can see that she has a CLB 9 in speaking and listening and a CLB 8 in reading and writing. Now we have to take that step of looking at the CLB score in relation to the amount of points that she gets in her first language. We could see in Shing's scenario that they only talk about her score in CELPIP, so we wouldn't even think about a second official language, which makes the question a little bit easier. So now we have to link CLB to those points. And we can see that with those Federal Skilled Worker points, she gets 6 in speaking. She also gets 6 in listening, and she gets 5 in reading and writing. When we're looking at the total language points that she gets in the Federal Skilled Worker Program, we can see that this adds up to 22. All right, so this is a pretty straightforward question in terms of assessing the language score. The next two we're going to look at can get a little bit trickier. But if you got 22 on here, congratulations. Okay, let's move on to Josie. So Josie covers a different element of language exams and how this can relate to your full skills exam. So with Josie, when we're looking at that scenario, we could see that she took both exams. So she took the English exam and the French exam. We have a bit of an easy kind of part as well because they give us the CLB rather than the individual language scores. So we can see in English she received a CLB 5 in each area of the exam, and in French she received a CLB 8. Remember that the highest score is the first language. So in her case, you probably know that her French language would be considered her first language for immigration. So let's correlate all of this together. So she received a CLB 8 in each element of the French exam. So all that we do is we connect those dots. So we go from that French CLB 8, we take a look at those points that she gets in the Federal Skilled Worker Program, which is a 5 in each. So she gets 5 in speaking, 5 in listening, 5 in reading, and 5 in writing. Now we have an extra little step in here. So she received a CLB 5 in her English exam. Now she received a CLB 5 in each element. So that's really important because, as you can see in the second official language description, if she received a CLB 4 in any element of that English exam, she wouldn't receive those additional points. However, she certainly met those minimum requirements over there, so she receives those extra 4 points for the second language. Now that puts her total at 24 points for the Federal Skilled Worker Program. And finally we have Alexa. So Alexa is a little bit more difficult because we're going to have to connect the dots for 2 language exams. But we could see that in IELTS she received a score of band 6.5 in each element. Now if you're using your test day data booklet, you can correlate that pretty easily to the CLB score. And in this one we have a mix. So she is a CLB 8 in speaking, and the difference is that in IELTS a band 6.5 is a CLB 7, so it's a little bit lower. Meanwhile, a 6.5 in reading, writing, and speaking is a CLB 8. So remember that a mix is perfectly fine as long as there isn't any individual score below a CLB 7. So with the Federal Skilled Worker points, we can add these up pretty easily now. So we can see that she has 5 points in speaking in the Federal Skilled Worker point system for language. She gets 5 for reading and writing as well, because an IELTS score of 6.5 correlates to a CLB 8 in speaking, reading, and writing, which correlates to 5 points each in the Federal Skilled Worker Program. However, we have listening. So listening was a band 6.5 in IELTS, which correlates to a CLB 7, which correlates to 4 points in the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So we could see now that with her first language, she would get 19 points in total. But remember that she took another exam. She took her TEF exam. So we have to take the extra step here and correlate this to the CLB. Now for this one we have CLB 5 for speaking because her TEF score was 229. In listening, she had a TEF score of 200, which correlates again to a CLB 5. In reading, she had a TEF score of 170, which also correlates to a CLB 5. However, the tricky part here is that her writing score was 200, but that correlates to a CLB 4. So with this one here, she does not get any points for that second official language, even though she's very close, of course, because that one part of her performance in French, which was her writing, was a CLB 4, not a CLB 5. So that's a good example of the fact that a person needs to have a minimum of CLB 5 in that second language score in order to get those points. Okay, so if you got the same score for Alexa, then congratulations again. This one requires a lot of steps, and it can be a little bit tricky, but I think you're getting the idea, and you're going to get better and better at this in the upcoming weeks leading towards the exam, because this type of question here is pretty similar in a lot of the areas of economic immigration. The federal skilled worker, of course, is a little bit trickier because you have that extra step of correlating the, well, first of all, the IELTS score, for example, to the CLB, which is in pretty much every economic stream and all the PMPs as well. Where the extra step comes in with the federal skilled worker program is correlating that CLB to the federal skilled worker points. So that could be a little bit tricky, but I hope that it has become a little bit easier for you. Alright, so if you worked your way through the language chart here, you can see that with Shing, we are now at 22 points for language. And that one was pretty straightforward to answer. With Josie, Josie was a little bit more complicated, but she's at 24 points. And Alexa is at 19 points. Okay, so let's take a look at experience now. So we're just about halfway through this point system, and experience, if you remember, is one of the minimum requirements for the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So if you remember from the previous video about the general requirements of this stream, there is an experience requirement, and it's 1 continuous year of NOC OAB experience. When we're looking at this in terms of points, experience has a maximum of 15 points, as you can see in Regulation 80. So let's take a look at this and how it relates to the scenarios that we're working through. Okay, so remember that this one is a little bit unique in comparison to the Federal Skilled Trades and Canadian Experience class, because the Federal Skilled Worker Program has a minimum requirement of 1 continuous year of NOC OAB experience. So that's one area that's unique, because the Canadian Experience class and the Federal Skilled Trades Program do not have that continuous requirement. The other part that's unique in this is that that experience has to be within the last 10 years, which is very different from the Canadian Experience class and the Federal Skilled Trades Program as well. Okay, when we're looking at points, so 1 year of experience is 9 points, and those points just keep going up by 2 for every additional 2 years, really. So 2 or 3 years of NOC OAB experience is 11, 4 to 5 years is 13 points, and 6 or more is 15. So there's a maximum in there. Even if a person has 26 years of experience, that maximum is 15 points. Okay, so if we look back to the general requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program, as we saw in the previous video, remember that with the NOC, they have to have performed the actions described in that lead statement and a substantial number of the main duties. If there are essential duties in there, they have to have performed all of them. One of the interesting things, of course, is that the person does not have to have met the employment requirements of this. All right, it must be the person's primary occupation as well, and the officer, if the person doesn't address the NOC properly, the officer does not have the responsibility to take a look at all of the other NOCs and maybe put the candidate into the perfect NOC for him. That's where the RCIC comes in, of course, because a mistake like this would really cost someone their immigration. So it's really, really important to make sure that the NOC descriptors match the job perfectly, because if they don't match perfectly for one NOC position, the officer will not take a look at all the other NOCs and correlate them for you. Okay, we saw this in the self-employed stream. Now, when we're looking at continuous experience as the minimum requirement for the Federal Skilled Worker Program, we can see that in terms of immigration, there's a little bit of a difference between the actual time a person spends at work and the time as is considered relevant when we're looking at immigration through the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So you can see that basically a year is a year. If a person has 7 months experience, that would not count for this. If a person has 22 months experience, sure, they meet those minimum requirements. So something really important for us, of course, is to take a look at this through the context of the scenarios that we're looking at. So with Shing, we have her work experience pretty clearly made for us. So we have she began working as a corporate accountant for China Corp 4 years ago. And after her first year, she was transferred to the Bangkok office to work on a full-time basis. When we are looking at Josie, in her scenario, the part that's relevant towards experience is the same as the part that's relevant to quite a few other elements in there. So her age, her education as well, it's all kind of in the same sentence or pair of sentences here. So we have she graduated high school at 18 and began working as an office administrator immediately. She's been in this position for the past 2 years. And finally, Alexa is pretty straightforward for experience. She has 7 years experience in this field. So that's an important area when we're looking at experience, of course, in terms of time. But remember that you have to look at experience in terms of role as well. So it's NOC OAB experience. Now, just from your general understanding of NOC, you know that a corporate accountant like Shing, that's a NOC A position. An office administrator would be NOC O, NOC A. And finally, with Alexa and her engineering work, that's a NOC A as well. Okay, so let's take a look at Shing with regard to the amount of points she would get under the Federal Skilled Worker Program in terms of her experience. So as we know from the scenario, she began working as a corporate accountant, so right away you know that that is definitely NOC OAB 4 years ago. Alright, and from the context and from the grammar as well, we know that she's still working there. So first of all, yes, it's a NOC no OAB position. that 1 year continuous. There's no mention of anything else, so we would definitely assume that correctly. And of course we have that 4 years that is mentioned as well. So this one's pretty straightforward. This would be close to the maximum amount of points because this would be at 13. Let's take a look at Josie. So with her as well, we can see that she is an office administrator. So that is definitely NOC OAB. By the way, just a little note for you, in terms of NOC, you're not going to have to memorize every single NOC to know what it is, if it's NOC O, A, or B. Remember, just in general, if it's some specialized work or professional work or something along the lines of administration or leadership, you're looking at NOC OAB. Alright, so as an office administrator, yes, so she's been in this position for the past 2 years, so we can assume 1 year of continuous and 2 years of total experience, which would put her at 11. And Alexa's really straightforward with this one here. So she's an engineer, which is definitely NOC A. She has that 1 year continuous, as we saw, and they give us this one pretty clearly. So they say 7 years of experience in this field. So that's what we would assume. And we could put this one at the maximum, 15. So remember that once a person reaches that maximum, it doesn't really make a difference if the person has 6 years experience or 66 years experience. They would reach that maximum amount of points at 15. Okay, so as we work through our grid over here, hopefully you got 13 points in experience for Shing, 11 points in experience for Josie, and Alexa reached the maximum, so 15. Okay, we've got a pretty easy one now, so now it's age, as you can see in Regulation 81. So there's a maximum amount of points in here, and that is 12. Okay, so as we can see in here, for the maximum amount of points, a person has to be between the age of 18 and 35. After 35, you can see that the amount of points decreases by 1 for every year that the person gets older until the age of 47, where it's at 0. Okay, so for the first one with Shing, it's pretty straightforward. They give us her age right away, 40. Alexa's the same thing. They tell us that she's 36. With Josie, though, we have to look a little bit deeper. It's similar to what we saw with education, in that she graduated high school at 18 years of age, began working in her career as an office administrator immediately, and has been in this position for the past 2 years. So with that, they don't tell us overtly how old she is. We'd have to kind of add the years together. Okay, so with Shing, all you have to do is just take a look at the age, take a look at the points, and correlate them. It's pretty straightforward with this one. Okay, as we saw with Josie, so she is 18, or was 18 when she graduated high school, and then they say that she began her career as an office administrator immediately, and she's been in that position for 2 years. So with this one, we would just add 18 plus 2, and that would give us 12 points. And now even if you're thinking maybe she finished high school at 18 and turned 19 the next day, so maybe she's actually 21, it doesn't really matter in this question just because we're looking at 18 to 35 as 12 points. So it wouldn't make a difference to those little tiny details, and you wouldn't really want to spend too much time thinking about that. And Alexa. So pretty straightforward again. She's 36. So that is 11 points. So as you can see, age is pretty straightforward. Shing got 7 points. Josie got 12 points, and Alexa got 11 points. Okay, this next one is a little bit more difficult, and this has to do with arranged employment. Now there's a maximum amount of points in here, and that is 10. So when we're looking at arranged employment, there's about 5 big scenarios that could happen, which would give the person 10 extra points under the Federal Skilled Worker Program. The first one is, as we can see here, so if the person is currently working in Canada on a temporary work permit, and there are all these other requirements, of course. So when the person originally came to Canada, that has to have been the result of an LMIA issued to hire that person. Okay, the work permit would have to be valid all the way through the whole process. And if the person receives permanent residency, the current employer has to have made an offer to hire them permanently. All right, the second one here is pretty much the same thing, except the person is exempt from the LMIA requirement. So maybe the person's coming under NAFTA or GATS or something like that. Okay, that work permit would have to be valid all the way through again. And the offer would have to be extended. So the only thing missing in this second option is really the fact that the job is LMIA exempt. Okay, then we have 3 other little options here. Okay, and this is for probably most scenarios in real life where a person is not in Canada and doesn't have a work permit. Okay, so the person wants to come to Canada as a permanent resident and then work. So that's one of the options. The other one is a person who is working in Canada but has a job offer from a different employer. All right, and the final one is a job that is LMIA exempt, but it's not exempt under an international or federal provincial agreement, so not under NAFTA or something like that. Now, the requirements for the employer are pretty strict. So there is, of course, the same requirement as the previous examples that we saw, in that the employer has to offer a job on a permanent full-time basis. And of course, there's the LMIA requirement. Okay, so as you probably know, for LMIAs, this has to be done from the employer himself or herself. This is only for NOC OAB positions. And of course, just like everything else really, the officer has to be satisfied that the person can actually perform the duties of the job. So when we go back to Shing as our example, we could see that she has an uncle in Regina, Saskatchewan, and he's promised her a job, even though he's not been able to obtain an LMIA. Now, she gets 0 points for arranged employment because she doesn't fall into this category. So she is outside Canada. She doesn't have a work permit or anything like that. There's no mention of anything over there. And you could see that that's in the if column, of course. And then in the and column, on the employer's side, he doesn't have an LMIA. So this arranged employment isn't considered valid for immigration purposes. When we look at Josie, we could see in her scenario, we have, though she's never been to Canada, she's been dating a Canadian man, Cecil, who lives in her town, and he told her that she can stay at his apartment in Toronto for free if she moves there. So you can see that this doesn't have anything to do with arranged employment or anything like that at all. So this one, of course, is 0. And finally, Alexa. So hers is pretty detailed in this regard. We could see that she is currently in Winnipeg working on a 1-year contract for Ericsson Technologies and received the job offer because there was a shortage of electrical engineers at the time. Ericsson received an LMIA because of this shortage. All right, and then the second part, they've offered her a full-time permanent job if she receives permanent residency. So she fits into this category perfectly, where she is currently in Canada on a temporary work permit. The work permit is valid. There's no mention of it not being valid all the way through the visa being issued. The important part, of course, is that second sentence. The work permit was issued by the CIC based on a positive LMIA. And that third one is perfect as well, the third sentence. So they've made an offer to give a permanent job if her application for permanent residency is successful. So she gets 10 points in the arranged employment area of the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Okay, so if you're working your way through your points grid again, I hope you've got about this right now. And we are now moving on to the final element of this for Shing and Josie. For Alexa, we've got an extra step that we'll go through at the end once we have all those points tallied up as well. So the final element for us to look at in terms of the points grid for the Federal Skilled Worker Program is the adaptability factor. Now this is regulation 83, and as you can see there's a maximum points in here of 10. So there's about 7 options in here for a person to get points. A lot of this is based on the spouse of the person. That'd be accompanying spouse, of course. So the spouse's language ability plays a role, and this is, as you can see on the top here, a CLB4. All right, so we talked about language already. Remember that this would be a CLB4 in each element. So if a person has a CLB5 in speaking, CLB3 in listening, and a CLB4 in reading and writing, they would not get those extra 5 points. Okay, if the applicant studied in Canada before, that would be 5 points. All right, if the spouse or partner studied in Canada, that's again 5 points. All right, working in Canada gives quite a lot of points, and you know this already from Express Entry as well. So working in Canada is such a good way to get points. In here, it gives the maximum in terms of adaptability. It gives 10 for 1 year of full-time employment in Canada. If the person's spouse worked in Canada as well, that's another 5 points. And they have arranged employment. So as we saw before, basically if a person gets arranged employment, as we saw in the previous points assessment, they would get 5 points in here in adaptability. And finally, relatives. So somebody with relatives in Canada would get 5 points. The definition of relative, though, is defined in here, of course, to be a parent, grandparent, child, a grandchild, a child of a parent, so that would be a stepbrother or something like that, a child of a grandparent, so that would be an uncle or aunt, or grandchild of a parent. So that could be your sister's kid, for example. Okay, so that person would have to be residing in Canada, 18 years or older, and a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, and that would be 5 points. So when we take a look at the scenario with regard to Shing, Josie, and Alexa, we can get a few hints about whether or not they would receive points in adaptability. So we could see with Shing, although she's never been to Canada, her husband worked in Hamilton, Ontario for a year as a computer technician a few years ago, and loves the idea of returning since he already speaks English at an intermediate level. For Josie, we have her dating a Canadian person, and she has a place to stay in Toronto. And Alexa, we have her working in Winnipeg, currently working in Winnipeg. And if you remember from before, she's an engineer, so that's knock away B. And she has an offer of a full-time job. So let's take a look at Shing. Now Shing is pretty interesting in terms of adaptability because we can see a few of the elements in the grid in this scenario. So remember that her husband worked in Hamilton for a year as a computer technician. All right, and he also speaks English at an intermediate level. So when you're looking at that, the intermediate level is obviously above a CLB4. So he would help her get 5 points in terms of adaptability. Now his work experience in Hamilton also helps because it was 1 year. There's no mention of it being illegal work or anything like that, so we wouldn't really assume that. And we can see that that is 5 points as well. Now she also has that uncle in Regina. So when we're looking at that, we can see that that would also be 5 points because he is the child of a grandparent for her, which would be 5 points. However, remember that the maximum in adaptability is 10 points. So she would receive 10 points, even though she does meet the qualifications of 15 points. All right, so the maximum here is 10 points, which is why she would receive 10 points in adaptability in the Federal Skilled Worker point system. For Josie, we can see that even though she's never been to Canada, she's been dating a Canadian, and he told her she could stay at his apartment in Toronto. So this doesn't really count for anything. If they were married, maybe that would count for some adaptability points. But just from dating someone or being friends with someone or anything like that, even boyfriend, girlfriend of a Canadian person, that doesn't help anything. If they're common law, spouse, conjugal, then that would likely give adaptability points. But in this case, she doesn't get anything. And Alexa, so with her, we have her currently working in Winnipeg on a 1-year contract and received the job offer because there was a shortage, so the LMIA job offer. She's working as an engineer, so knock OAB. The trick with this one is in that second paragraph. So we could see that the company's been very happy with her work performance since she started a couple months ago. So currently she's been working in Canada only for a couple of months. But remember, for those 10 adaptability points for work experience in Canada, she would have to have worked for a year. However, she does meet those 5 points for arranged employment. So at the end, we can see that Shing has 75 points in the federal skilled worker selection grid. Josie has 52 points, and Alexa has 81. Now with Shing and Josie, we're going to take a look at the questions again in a second here, but those ones are pretty much finished in the answer, so you should get the answer now. Alexa, we have to move on a little bit more. We've completed about half of it because we have to see how all this relates to express entry. Okay, so when we're looking at Shing again, we can see that just by going through the question once more. So Shing, 40, is from China, has been living in Thailand for the past 3 years. She began working as a corporate accountant for China Corp 4 years ago, and after her first year she was transferred to the Bangkok office to work on a full-time basis. She holds a 4-year bachelor's degree and master's degree in finance, received a CELPIP score of 9 in speaking and listening and 8 in reading and writing. So if you remember, we analyzed all this in detail. Now we have the adaptability portion that we just saw. So although she's never been to Canada, her husband worked in Hamilton, Ontario for a year as a computer technician a few years ago. Loves the idea of returning since he already speaks English at an intermediate level. She also has an uncle in Regina, Saskatchewan, who's promised her a job, even though he's not been able to obtain an LMIA. And as you remember from that didn't give any points. All right, is Shing likely to meet the minimum points requirements of the federal skilled worker class to allow her to move into the pool of qualified candidates in express entry? So as we saw, she has 75 points. So number one, of course, is wrong because it says she has 90 points. When we take a look at C, we could see that she did meet the minimum requirements. If you remember from the previous lesson on those general requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program, that those requirements are, there's 3 big things to look at in order to meet the minimum requirements. One, of course, is experience, so 1 year continuous NOC OAB work experience, which she obviously has. One is that minimum education requirement, so minimum of high school, which she has a master's degree. And finally, the language, which she exceeded as well. So C is pretty impossible because she does meet those minimum requirements. And for D, she has 75 points, as we saw. So that is not valid either. All right, so B is the correct answer there. If you got that right at the beginning when we started the lesson, then really good for you. This one is, I said it's an easy question, but there's some tricky little parts in there for you to look at. So congratulations if you got this one correct. Let's see if you got the other ones correct as well. Let's take a look at Josie again, because we went into really big detail with all of these questions. So it's good to just take a step back and see this as a question again. All right, so Josie is an Estonian who is exploring her immigration options and would like to know if she qualifies for the Federal Skilled Worker Program if she were to make an express entry profile. She is very serious about her immigration plan, has already taken her English and French language exams. In English, she received a CLB 5 in each area, and in French, she received a CLB 8 in each area. So if you remember, we took a look at this very thoroughly. This was a good example of how whichever language is the strongest, that's considered the first language in this. So in her case, her French was stronger, and exceeded the minimum requirements, of course, of the first language, which was CLB 7, so that would be considered her first language in this. All right, then we have her work experience that we saw before. So she graduated from high school at 18 and began working as an office administrator immediately. She's been in this position for 2 years. So we saw that when we looked at her work experience. And then we have the part that didn't give her any points in adaptability, as we saw, which was that she's dating a Canadian person and he told her that she can stay in his apartment in Toronto for free. Now, when we look at the question itself, it asks if she meets the minimum requirements in terms of points for the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So as we know, the minimum in terms of those points is 67. We saw that she has 52. So when we take a look at A, yes, because she meets the minimum requirements in terms of education, experience, and language. Yes, those are the minimum requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program, but there's also the 67 points requirement. Now, if a person doesn't get that, then they don't meet those minimum requirements. Okay, for B, she exceeds the minimum amount of points required. As we saw, she has 52 and she needs 67. So B is impossible. And we have D. So D touches on express entry a little bit, and if you have a great understanding of express entry, you'll know that this is pretty impossible because she does not meet the requirement. And finally, we're back to Alexa. So we spent quite a bit of time analyzing this question through the area of the Federal Skilled Worker points system. However, remember that we're just about halfway there in answering this question because the other half of this is with express entry. So I'll just read this out to you again so we can take a step back and see the question as a whole once more. So again, we have Alexa. Alexa is a 36-year-old citizen of Finland and would like to immigrate to Canada through the Federal Skilled Worker Program, as she feels that this would give her the freedom to live anywhere in Canada that she wants to, depending on which city she likes best. So through that we could see the intent and everything like that, and it gives us the age pretty clearly, as we saw. She's currently working in Winnipeg on a 1-year contract for Ericsson Technologies. Received the job offer because of an electrical engineer shortage at that time. Here is a part that we saw was really important, and this part here is actually going to play a role in the next step that we're going to take a look at in seeing this through the perspective of express entry. Now that important part is over here with Ericsson. So Ericsson received an LMIA because of this shortage and hired Alexa immediately after her interview by telephone because they were impressed with her 7 years of experience in this field. So that's a pretty important sentence that we'll see again in a few minutes. All right, and we could see as we carry on that they've offered her a full-time permanent job, on the condition, though, that she receives permanent residency. We took a look at her education as well, so we saw her bachelor's degree, so a 4-year bachelor's degree from the University of Finland in engineering, and that master's degree from the online master's degree store. We also saw how the ECA relates to this, and that's a really important lesson that is great for you because this can play a role in pretty much any economic immigration stream. So in this case here, her master's degree was not accepted as being the equivalent of a Canadian master's degree, but her bachelor's degree was. So we just pretty much delete that master's degree from the scenario here. Okay, we saw her language scores as well. Now with this, she had a 6.5 in each area of her IELTS exam, and we saw her TEF score at 200 in listening and writing, 170 in reading, and 229 in speaking. So that's another really important lesson that we covered quite a bit today, and that is, of course, how language results play a role in economic immigration. So remember with Alexa, this is, again, a really great example of how everything is so related in the economic streams. So we have the express entry procedures portion that you really have to understand in order to be able to answer this question. We have the federal skilled worker points section that you also have to be able to understand, that we worked through already. And finally, the CRS points for express entry. So everything's related, but we're going to see how in the next few minutes here.
All right, so in taking a look at how to get this answer, I'm going to show you a little secret here. I don't think it's a secret, it's a strategy really. And this is something you'll be able to do quite a bit after you keep practicing with the material if you attend the seminar. And that is, of course, learning how to remove answers quickly as well. So here, I want you to think just a little bit deeper. I know you're working a lot because there's a lot of detail in this story, but we can eliminate two answers pretty much right away. And which two answers can we eliminate right away? Even without even looking into too much detail into the story, we can actually eliminate one of these for sure. And which one is that? Well, if you answered that we can eliminate D as an option, perfect. That's exactly correct. When you think of D and what we learned about express entry in general, well, if someone does not meet those requirements of the FSW, and with her, I mean, there's no indication she meets the requirements of CEC or FST either, right? So she doesn't even qualify to be assessed for CRS points. So right away, D just doesn't exist for us. So you used your general knowledge of express entry to go and eliminate an answer already. And again, when we think a little bit deeper into those procedures of express entry, into our general knowledge of express entry and, well, especially express entry points and how it relates to federal skilled worker points. I've got a slide for you on this in a couple minutes here, but we know, or I hope you know, that federal skilled worker points are separate from CRS points, right? So they are, of course, assessing the same thing. For example, they're assessing someone's education, but it's being assessed in different ways, and those two ways are not related to each other. So federal skilled worker does not get added to those CRS points. So again, if you had this general knowledge, and that's why you're working through these lessons, right? So that you can get that foundation of knowledge. And if you saw this in the exam, I mean, you'd be pretty happy because you can eliminate C and D right away. So good job with that. Then we're left with two other options here. So we have A and B now. So for A and B, we need to think a little bit in terms of the story. And if you took the seminar, you know how to answer this actually. You probably got this one really quickly, even though it's a pretty big question, because we talk about some strategies for that. But over here as well, I can give you a hint that we are going to think about the points and think about if we need to really invest a lot of time in looking at how many points she has. That's the hint for you, okay? And I'll talk about this in detail in the next couple slides here. So when we worked through Alexa's CRS points, and this is a good activity for you because you do this a lot with your job later on. Once you become an immigration consultant, you're pretty much always looking at people's CRS points as a first option. And here we added them up to 369. So we went through this really thoroughly in this lesson, and I think it's a good example of what you do in real life, because this is going to be second nature for you, really. You're going to keep adding up people's points. You're going to get really fast at it, and because your goal really is if you have somebody who exceeds those CRS points, well, you are in heaven because you get to help somebody immigrate quickly. So when we take a step back and we look at how this relates to Express Entry as a whole, when we think of those procedures related to Express Entry, well, we could see that, sure, she would meet part of those steps, but she wouldn't exceed that CRS score. So for us, A is the correct answer. Okay, so let's say that we began working through this question, and you're in the exam, your time's counting down, you have to move really, really, really quickly to make sure we have enough time to finish everything. And we eliminated C and D. So now we're choosing between A and B, and you want to answer this question really quickly, right? Because the exam is, of course, 3 hours, 140 questions. So we need to move quickly, quickly, quickly. Well, there's a question for you on the bottom, a question about a question, I guess, is what we could say. Do we still need to complete the Express Entry portion of this question? So we did it already just because we're learning. But if this were the exam and you were doing this quickly and you came up just quickly with the 81 FSW points, and you had an idea of maybe 300 or somewhere like that, or under 450 anyways for CRS points, without being too precise, right? What would you do in that situation? We talked about that, of course, as one of these strategies during the seminar, but really, I'll give you the real quick advice here, and that is to put A as your answer. I mean, do you need to add up all those points to really make sure that you have 369 and not 364 or 372? No, it doesn't really matter. And then one of the other great lessons from here is that these 2 points systems are separate. So somebody asked me once if the federal skilled worker points get added to the Express Entry points, and I've included this slide kind of since then because I can see how it can be a little bit confusing, right? So really, when you think of these points, they're assessing the same things, and I think that's where the confusing part comes in. In that they're assessing a person's language, a person's education, work experience, age, etc. But they're assessing them in different ways. So if a person meets those minimum requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program, remember it's not just the points, but if a person meets those minimum requirements, well, then they move on to the pool of candidates and receive, of course, that CRS points assessment. And the CRS points assessment is related to, of course, education, work experience, etc. It's not related to the federal skilled worker points that a person gets.
Now finally, at the end of this lesson, let's just do a tiny little review about some important points to remember with Express Entry. As you can see, everything is related really. So it's really important for you to understand Express Entry procedures, the CRS points system, the Federal Skilled Trades Program, the Canadian Experience class, the Federal Skilled Worker Program, and the Federal Skilled Worker Points System. These are all interrelated. If you're missing one little link in this chain, then you're going to have a pretty rough time in your exam. Because as we just saw with the question of Alexa, for example, if somebody only knew about the Federal Skilled Worker Program but didn't know about maybe the Express Entry CRS points system, then they would probably not get the correct answer in this. The same thing with if somebody only knew about the Express Entry procedures and CRS system but didn't know how to really analyze those Federal Skilled Worker points. They would, again, probably not get the correct answer. So everything is related. We've got all the lessons here for you, so really work your way through those, and then you're going to be really ready to tackle anything having to do with the economic stream on your exam, especially anything having to do with the Federal Skilled Worker Program, Federal Skilled Trades, and Canadian Experience class as they relate to Express Entry. So one of those points that is pretty important to remember, and just because we've looked at these questions today really in such detail, that it's important to take a step back and just remember that a person needs to meet all of those requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program, not just the points. So they have to meet the work experience requirements, the language requirements, and the education requirements. So we saw this in that previous lesson on the Federal Skilled Worker Program and the general requirements, but it's really important to remember that even if a person has maybe 80 points in the Federal Skilled Worker Program, if they're missing one of these requirements, they don't qualify for this program, and the application will not proceed. So another really important lesson regarding Express Entry is to remember to do everything really step by step when you're analyzing if someone can immigrate to Canada through Express Entry or not. If someone meets the required CRS points, that means you're sort of moving one step ahead. And let's take a look at an example here. So somebody who worked in Canada for 5 years, worked outside Canada for 5 years, is fluent in both official languages, and is 27 years old. If you analyze this quickly in the CRS points system, you might say, well, yes, this person has 450 points. Now, if we look at this through the context of the Federal Skilled Worker Program, we can see that he doesn't actually meet the requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program because he doesn't have the educational requirements. In real life, he might meet the requirements, of course, of the Canadian Experience class, but as we are looking at the Federal Skilled Worker Program, you would take that first step and see if he qualifies for the Federal Skilled Worker Program before receiving an ITA, of course. Now, another important lesson here is pretty similar to what we just saw. All right, so this person here is 25 with a CLB 7, which is great, high school diploma, 1 year of NOC A experience. So in your mind, you could probably see that he meets the minimum requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program, except when you take a look at the points. So this person here only has 40 points, so he does not actually meet the minimum requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So with this, of course, he would not move into that pool of candidates and would not receive a CRS score. Okay, so here is a really important lesson, just to remind ourselves again. We saw this in the lesson here already, but just another reminder because it's incredibly important to be able to fully understand the process, of course, for Express Entry, how it relates to the points system, and of course how all of this relates, in this case, to the Federal Skilled Worker Program, but it's very similar for the Canadian Experience class and the Federal Skilled Trades Program. The Federal Skilled Worker Program, of course, has that extra step of the points system. So somebody who meets the minimum requirements of one of these streams does not automatically qualify for an invitation to apply. Now, if we remember, we have these big steps, these 4 steps in the process of someone moving from just creating a profile all the way through to obtaining permanent residency. Now, as an immigration consultant, or future immigration consultants, you have a step before the profile step, and that would be, of course, your assessment of the person to see if the person would actually move from the express entry pool into receiving an invitation to apply, and of course seeing if the person meets the minimum requirements required to move into that express entry pool. So remember that if a person meets those minimum requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program, Federal Skilled Trades, or Canadian Experience class, they would move into that pool of candidates. A CRS score is assigned, and that's based on all those elements that we looked at already. So language, education, experience, age, combinations of all of these, the person's spouse, etc. Now the really important part is here. Now if the person meets or exceeds the minimum CRS score, that person would receive an invitation to apply through one of these streams. Then that person applies for permanent residence. This is the part that can be a little bit tricky for some people to understand, and that is if the person doesn't have that minimum CRS score or higher, they will not move into the next step. So they will not receive an invitation to apply. And when we take a look at procedures in general and how the CRS score is set, it's the IRCC. So the CIC sets that score. Now in real life, it's been at about 450 to 480 points for the past year. Now if a person doesn't have above that, doesn't receive a job offer, doesn't receive a PNP, a nomination, then they wouldn't meet those points and they wouldn't proceed to receive an invitation to apply. Okay, so remember that express entry has all these really important steps to take a look at, and that a person has to go all the way through in order to receive that invitation to apply through Federal Skilled Worker, Federal Skilled Trades, Canadian Experience class, or possibly a PMP, and to receive their permanent residency. Okay, and you have one final point here, and that has to do with substitute evaluation. So remember that the officer can use his discretion to either make a positive or negative substitute evaluation. So an example of a positive substitute evaluation would be if somebody maybe is missing one of the requirements. Let's say, for example, somebody applying under the Federal Skilled Worker Program, and he has a PhD, and the language is CLB 9, but he's been a teacher for the past 10 years, let's say, and works only during the school season, so he has maybe 4 months off in the summertime or whatever. So maybe he wouldn't meet those requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program because he's missing the 12 continuous months. In a case like that, for example, the officer could use his discretion to make a positive substitute evaluation to say that the person does meet the minimum requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program in that case. Now, this can't just be because the officer likes the person or something like that. There has to be reasons for it, of course, and he has to have concurrence of the second officer. So he has to bring that to a second officer, and that officer has to concur. So that's the same for positive and negative as well. So for a negative substitute evaluation, let's say, for example, somebody is a carpenter from somewhere, and he has lots of experience and language and everything like that, but maybe the age, maybe he's 80 years old or something like that, so the officer doesn't think the person will be able to integrate into the Canadian workforce, then he might make a negative substitute evaluation. where a person does meet the minimum requirements, but maybe he wouldn't be able to really integrate into a Canadian workforce. Okay, so that's it. Congratulations if you worked your way through this entire lesson. It's been about 2 hours. So a very big thank you for tuning in, for your attention and your time, of course. If you're taking the full skills exam in the next few weeks or the next maybe couple of months, I'll just give you a congratulations in advance because you're obviously preparing for the exam by working your way through these lessons. All right, well, thank you so much, and tune in next time where we will work through some other important lessons so that you can pass your full skills exam. All right, have a great day, and thanks again.